Absolutely. I typically expect for kind of like my needs to be met, like in some capacity, like whether that's like if I need to use the restroom, they will provide a space for me to use the restroom, or if I'm hungry, they might offer a snack. So just kind of like having my needs be met, that like some of those basic needs. That's what I kind of expect when I go over to someone's home.
No conflict.
No conflict. You want to say more about that, Pat?
That would be kind of odd if they invited you to their house and craziness erupted around everywhere.
Sure. You want minimal craziness. That's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
I expect some acknowledgement that I'm there.
Okay,
this is usually with a larger group, people invite you, and then you're greeted at the door, but there's no interaction after that. You get ready to leave. So just throughout the evening or afternoon, some acknowledgement of, that you're present.
Yep. So being acknowledged. Yeah, it'd be kind of strange if you went over to someone's home and they just were like, yep, we're going to ignore you. We're just not going to acknowledge your presence.
That usually happens when it's a larger group.
Sure. Yeah. And the other question for discussion is, how do you feel when someone does something nice to you out of the blue? Do you feel suspicious, thankful, guilty? Maybe like you need to reciprocate in some capacity. How do you feel when someone does something nice to you out of the blue?
Wonder why.
Okay, so wondering why. Maybe like a hint of suspicion. Yeah, absolutely.
I just had a very dear friend offer me, she heard me say a couple of months ago, I'm looking for a pocketbook, and she mentioned Bosco. So she's kind of lady that has top class and lots of pocketbooks and so forth. And she just gave me a pocketbook that has a price tag of $120 that she had for herself, but then she had forgotten and bought one like it. And I just was just grateful, thankful, appreciative to have a friend like that.
So someone who took notice of what you were wanting and they followed through and they got you this gift, which is really nice. And so you're thankful for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes you can feel a little guilty that maybe I'm undeserving of such a gift.
Yeah, undeserving of such a gift, feeling a little guilty. Yeah, depending on the gift, for sure. Yeah. Well, Rick, that's a great segue into our text. So we're going to be reading John 13 today. And we are in the now thick of the Reformed theology sermon series we're going to be going through. We're looking at the 5 points of Reformed theology. TULIP, which is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. So these are kind of like the foundation blocks of our Reformed theology. And this week, I will be preaching on unconditional election. And so last week, Pastor Chris preached using a letter from Paul, and letters from Paul are always so good. But I thought using more of a narrative would be, thank you, Rick.
Hopefully a little less feedback.
A little less feedback. Great. Thought using a narrative story would maybe help us understand a bit more of what unconditional election looks like, especially in the life of Jesus. So before reading the passage, so John 13, maybe in your Bibles, it has like a little like title. It's in mine, it says Jesus washes the disciples' feet. So maybe this is a story that you've read before. We typically will read this during Holy Week. So before reading the passage, think about Maundy Thursday and what you know about Maundy Thursday and what is the setting in Jesus' life and the church year. So I kind of gave a part of it away. Holy Week.
Right before Easter.
Right before Easter, yep, but right before Good Friday.
Right before his
crucifixion. Thursday was before Friday.
Quote unquote upper room.
Yep, so the upper room, yes. Yep.
Praying in the garden.
Yep, praying in the garden. And also this is Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. So Thursday is kind of a big day in Jesus' life. And so knowing some of this context that, this is right before going to the cross, this is what Jesus chooses to do with his time. So we're going to read through John 13, 1 through 17. And I'd prefer for us to read through it twice so that we can actually really hear what's going on. So if I could have 2 volunteers read through John 13, 1 through 17.
Yep.
So Rick, you'll read it first, and can I have a second volunteer?
Well, I'll read the message if you want.
Great. So Ginny, you'll read it after Rick. So Rick, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them."
Just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that the time had come to leave this world to go to the Father. Having loved his dear companions, He continued to love them right to the end. It was supper time. The devil by now had Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, firmly in his grip, all set for the betrayal. Jesus knew that the Father had put him in complete charge of everything, that he came from God and was on his way back to God. So he got up from the supper table, set aside his robe, and put on an apron. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with his apron. When he got to Simon Peter, Peter said, "Master, you wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but it will be clear enough to you later." Peter persisted, "You're not going to wash my feet ever." Jesus said, "If I don't wash you, you can't be part of what I'm doing." "Master," said Peter, "not only my feet then. Wash my hands, wash my head." Jesus said, "If you've had a bath in the morning, you only need your feet washed now, and you're clean from head to toe. My concern, you understand, is holiness, not hygiene. So now you're clean, but not every one of you." He knew who was betraying him. That's why he said, "Not every one of you." After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to his place at the table. Then he said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee doesn't give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it and live a blessed life."
Thank you. So this passage is really rich with a whole lot of different nuances. So we're just going to parse through some of them. And so we're going to start with question 3. What did Jesus know as he was preparing the, quote, Passover meal? You can look at verses 1 through 3 if you're needing some assistance.
Excuse me. That this was likely his last night of freedom and the last night on earth.
It's his last night. Yeah, it's amazing to me what, the question, what would you do if you knew like when you were going to die? How would you spend that time? And we see what Jesus does. So he knows he's going to die. He knows that this is happening. Plans are in place. Anything else?
He knew who was going to betray him.
He knew who was going to betray him. Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Judas's presence there is very fascinating to me. Yeah.
He knew he was returning to God.
He knew he was going to return to God. Yeah, so there was like an assurance, like almost like a deep peace. Like, I know I'm going to the Father. Absolutely. So what is important about naming that Judas is at the table? This is question 4. And then this is just a question for pondering, maybe even for your own self. But do you think you could serve someone knowing that they would betray you? So the first question, what's important about naming that Judas is at the table?
Just confirmation that Jesus' enemy is there, and Jesus is serving him and loving him as he has told us throughout Scriptures to love our enemies. And he's showing us that he is doing that, not just saying that.
Yeah, he's like literally practicing what he's preaching. yeah, so he's loving his enemy, a person who's going to betray him. Yep.
Be like, is the phrase, like heaping coals on their head? Doing good things to your enemy is like heaping hot coals on their head.
I have not heard that phrase before. I haven't heard that.
Okay.
Heaping coals on.
Is it because they know your enemies and you're still doing nice things for them? And
Yeah. So even.
Somewhere.
what's that?
That's in here somewhere.
It is.
Oh, maybe I should know it.
That's okay.
Hey, I don't know everything. Hey.
I guess I kind of like that phrase, that passage.
Yeah. So it's almost like even though we acknowledge that we're enemies or we disagree, I'm still going to love you. I'm still going to offer you kindness. Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, this is where Jesus gets really tricky for me, because Jesus is doing something that I don't think I would normally do. Knowing that someone would betray me, knowing that someone will hurt me, it would be really hard for me to have them over and to serve them and to, I mean, Jesus even goes to the next level. We see in just a little bit, but just to serve them in such a capacity, there's something there that I think is important also for us now. Jenny, you say something.
Interesting. In this case, Jesus is really kind of stuck with him being there because he's been part of every movement for 2 years or so.
Yeah.
So in a way, Jesus is acknowledging the reality of his being stuck with the situation, and this is what's going to happen next.
Yeah, Jesus is kind of like, yeah, these are my disciples, these are my people, and people are not perfect.
I think it's also a message to Judas that I know what you're going to do.
Yeah, so say more about that.
Well, to sort of single him out and to say, it's like, I don't know, just that he says about something about except for one of you. So it's sort of like, without coming right out and saying it, he's saying to Judas, because Judas knows, and Jesus is saying to him, I know too.
Yeah, so there's that like
unspoken looking. I know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And Judas doesn't respond. Judas doesn't try and defend himself. He doesn't acknowledge, are you talking about me? Because he's stuck too. I mean, he can't really have a conversation because they're in this group. So it was sort of clever of Jesus to do that in the group as opposed to pulling Judas aside.
Yeah. Jesus is very clever like that.
Yes. And say, hey, look, I know what's going on here.
So this unspoken yes.
And I wonder what all
what's
the other
going on.
disciples thought when he said that.
They're probably like, oh my gosh, I hope Jesus isn't talking about me. Or like, I mean, I think I can't imagine, because Jesus is their teacher and their Lord and also their friend and fellow sojourner. And so there's this like, oh, I really hope that Jesus isn't trying to like call me out like he's called out the Pharisees or like calling out the, different religious leaders and authority at the time. Because, I mean, we see Jesus does that throughout. He does that for those in power, but then also those who are closest to him as well. Absolutely.
Can I just say that people can serve someone knowing they would betray you.
So people can serve.
Someone knowing they could or would betray you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, so for you, you believe that, yeah, this is totally possible, that someone
I'm confident of it.
yeah, you're confident that even knowing someone will betray you, you can still serve them. You still have the capacity to serve them. Great.
But this is a pretty big betrayal.
It's a pretty big betrayal. It is.
I don't know if I thought someone was going to turn me over to the authorities so I could be crucified, that I would be so kind
Yep.
as to even have them in my house.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it sometimes they say Judas betraying Jesus to try and force his hand?
Mm-hmm.
Judas wanted Jesus to step up and show how powerful he was.
Mm-hmm.
So, not necessarily, I don't know if Jesus really, or Judas thought it would end the way it did. I think he thought maybe Jesus would say, show the Pharisees that he was more powerful. They didn't have control of him. So. He surely showed remorse at the end.
Yes. Judas definitely showed remorse. But it's also it's interesting because he still does it, and Jesus is kind of like, why would you test me? The Pharisees, and that's something that the Pharisees would try to trick him into doing something. But yeah, Judas definitely shows remorse at the end. Absolutely. Which makes Judas all the more compelling in my mind. He's not someone who I like to just push away. I think he has a story that we can learn from. So we kind of talked a little bit, how does Jesus serve the disciples? How does he serve them? This isn't a trick question.
Washing their feet.
He washes their feet. Yes. I was going to say, this Rick, good job. You get the gold star today. Good job. So Jesus serves the disciples by washing their feet. And, who, maybe put on your historian hats now, who would wash feet in this time?
Usually a slave.
A slave.
Or servant.
Slave, servant. Yep. And so, what might this signal about the nature of Jesus, since this was typically a servant-slave role to wash the feet? I mean, gosh, washing feet, that just sounds so gross. Especially at this time, they didn't have proper shoes. So their feet were just...
Animals were walking around pooping all over the street.
And just I can't, just the place is caked, their feet are caked in dirt and all the goodness from the day. And, that was something it was a very sacred thing, but it was also a servant's role. So what does that teach us about Jesus' nature and his character?
Total humility.
Total humility.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, humbling himself to be a servant, to take on that role. And I don't know, have any of you ever had your feet washed before? Maybe.
It's
Not
not piggy
religious.
went to market, this little piggy stayed home. My father.
Maybe not in a religious capacity, but
Pedicure.
pedicure, the feet, there's something very intimate about that too. It's this is where I'm, it's very tender. It can be a very connecting, intimate experience. I've had my feet washed in a religious experience, and that's been very powerful because it's a total humbling. I don't just go over to someone's house and be like, "Can you wash my feet?" Yes, Chris.
I think, to me, the washing of the feet is the obvious how he's serving them.
Mm.
But I guess it's what the washing of the feet symbolizes, and he's serving them to get them into heaven.
Mm. So serving them so that they can get into heaven.
Because they have to be clean. They have to follow his lead. So he's saying, this is one, I'm going to show you one thing you need to do to follow me into heaven.
Yeah. Do you think that, because we say in the Lord's Prayer, like heaven and earth, they're kind of combined. How can we bring those heavenly attributes here on earth right now? I wonder if, Jesus is kind of, I agree there's a sense of cleansing, righteousness, and also...
Well, he's trying to make them teachers.
Yeah.
Of, this is one of the things you can do to follow me. So I'll demonstrate it to you. Like how a teacher teaches a child to write.
Right.
This is how I'm going to show you how to do this.
Mm.
And now you've got to try to write on your name.
Yeah.
I see that as the same thing. I'm going to show you. And then him having them wash each other's feet is, okay, now I want to see you do it to know that you're doing it correctly.
Yeah,
that
so
you bought into this practice.
So serving one another, absolutely, and just, you're right, him as their teacher is trying to show them, what does humility look like? And if I'm the one who you are putting your faith in, this is how you can show your faith, And that's what, at the very end, you're blessed if you do these things, if you do these types of things. Granted, right now, I don't think many of us are like, can I wash your feet, as a way to serve people? But we can talk about that, what a modern day example would look like. But, so before we move on, could someone go to Luke 22? So it's just the chapter before John. So Luke 22, verse 24. And if whoever gets there first, it's not a race. If they could read that, so then we can see what are the disciples discussing before Jesus washes their feet.
22 what?
Verse 24.
A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest.
Silly disciples.
Oh, not
Who is the greatest disciple?
yes.
What? So how might that have influenced Jesus' action?
Again, Jesus is trying to exemplify that he came, and thus the disciples should come to serve and not be served.
Mm.
And you're not trying to seek to be the greatest, you're trying to seek to be the humblest?
The most humble?
Most humble?
Yeah, to serve and not to be served. Yes. Yeah.
My first thought I had was when he said, don't want to sit at the head of the table at an important dinner. Go to the foot of the table.
Yeah. Yeah. Chris?
But he didn't choose one to wash. He didn't pick one in washing of the feet. He basically said, there's no hierarchy here.
Yeah.
I'm going to wash everybody's feet.
I'm going to wash everyone's feet. Yeah, there's no hierarchy in discipleship or maybe even the kingdom of God. Which then if we go back to John 13 and look at verse 6, so Peter is a dynamic character. Peter, the rock, the church, in a lot of ways, I think Peter kind of represents us in stories. And so what is Peter's inquiry in verse 6? And why do you think he asks this question?
Are we in Luke or John?
So, yep, we're in John 13 again. Yep.
Jesus knew he was going to betray him. But did Peter know that too?
So, Marguerite asked, so Jesus knew that Peter was going to deny him, but did Peter know that? That's a really good question. You know, it's kind of like who knows what. It's like sometimes Jesus knows. I mean, Jesus knows what we're going to do before we do, but does Peter know? I'm not sure, actually. But that's a good.
I would tend to think no, because the disciples still didn't think he was going to die. Judas said he was going to, kind of knew he was going to betray him, but I think as Steve mentioned, Judas thought that Jesus was then going to rise up and kind of take control. So I don't think Peter ever thought he was going to be in a situation where he'd have to deny Jesus, that he'd be sitting out in the trial type of situation, say, "Oh no, I don't know him."
Yeah. So Peter, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And I loved that, Rick, you kind of like added that nuance, like my feet. What do you think is behind that question? Do you think it's just because it's such a cultural faux pas, or do you think there is something more personal with Peter?
Peter couldn't get over the respect he had for Jesus, and to allow him to do something so menial.
Yeah. So Peter couldn't get over like how meaningful and beautiful this act was. Just like couldn't receive it. Couldn't receive such a gift. Yeah. Any other wonderings?
It sounds like he was really surprised.
Yeah, really shocked. Absolutely. Sometimes grace can be shocking.
Sometimes it can.
So Jesus then says, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. What do you think Jesus is implying by that? And maybe, so there's like a literal way that Jesus could mean it, or it could be more spiritual, metaphorical. What do you think Jesus means when he says, unless I wash you, you have no share with me?
Kind of a spiritual washing of our insides, not just our physical skin.
Yeah, I think Ginny's text was like, it's not about hygiene, it's about holiness. I loved that. So it's like a spiritual washing of our insides. And only Jesus can do that. It's not something that we can do, really. We can't force it on ourselves or other people. Anything else that comes up?
I'm a little confused. It's nothing new.
Tell me, what's going on in your brain?
Does he wash Judas's feet or doesn't he?
So it says that he washes the disciples' feet. He considers Judas a disciple. And so I am in the camp, and I believe a lot of commentators and theologians would also agree that indeed, just as much as Judas partook of the Lord's Supper, Judas also partook of the foot washing. And so did Peter. Peter, who is asking all these questions, Peter, who's going to deny Christ in like a couple of chapters, he also is getting his feet washed. He's also a part of the Lord's Supper. He's also going to be called he's the church on which we are founded, and yet he denies Christ. I mean, it's So yeah, like to say that, it's like the disciples, that's like all of them. It's also saying like, what about Bartholomew? Yes, Bartholomew is also a part of that, but we don't really talk about him ever.
Peter always has to struggle and work out and think about it.
He's a verbal processor, yes. Yes, he's a verbal processor, and we love him for it because he asks the things that I think we all want to ask, but don't have the chutzpah to do so. Yeah, Chris, do you have more?
Well, why I raised that question is because verse 11, the last part of it, it said, Jesus said, not all of you are clean. Well, if washing of the feet was to make them clean, but then he says that, I just wondered if that meant he didn't wash Jesus' feet, because he acknowledges not all of them are clean.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So once again, it's kind of this, what does the foot washing do? It's kind of like baptism. So it's the symbolism. Is it symbolism, or is like once you baptize an infant, they will never sin again? Probably not. And so, but actually just not, because last week we talked about total depravity. So we know that that's going to happen. But I think in this capacity, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. And yet he still is choosing to wash his feet, to cleanse him in maybe a literal way, but also in a metaphorical, like I'm still going to humble myself and serve you. But maybe looking at his heart.
Forgive 70 times 7?
Yes. So forgiving 70 times 7. That's a hard one. That's really, that's a lot of times to forgive someone. Yeah.
So it appears that he cleansed Judas before Judas committed the act,
He washed his feet.
which is cleansing.
So once again, it's how you view is the foot washing a symbol, or is it literal? What do you think, Chris? It depends on what, how, this is where interpretation of scripture gets really interesting, because it could be more of a symbolic, like, it could be, and I'll say what I think is that it symbolizes more of the character of Christ than whether or not like we're going to be holy and blameless after our feet are washed. Do you want to mull that over a little bit?
It's just I'm thinking of me personally.
Okay.
I don't know if I would do it before you did the act. I might do it afterwards. I might, after you betrayed me, I might forgive you and symbolically do that. I don't know if I would do it knowing what Jesus knows prior to you betraying me. Because then it's sort of like, well, to Judas, why shouldn't I betray him? I've already been cleansed.
I agree with you, because if he's almost sounding hypocritical, Jesus at that point, because if he says, if I wash your feet, you are entirely clean, and he isn't. He's going to continue to have this contract with the hierarchies to betray Jesus. So I agree with her. I'd rather wash his feet have his feet washed afterwards to help him with his guilt and to give him real cleanness if he wants
So I'll use the example again of baptism because I think that can be like what might feel familiar for us today is, so let's just say an adult is baptized, does that mean that they need to be rebaptized every time that they have committed a sin?
Might as well just live in a bathtub then.
Might as well just live in a bathtub. Yes. So it's almost like, to what end does someone, to what end is cleansing look like? Because we see also Judas betrays Christ. Peter denies him. That happens too. So what, do we also need to wash Peter's feet afterwards? It's just, to what end does someone, does grace include that?
The grace enveloped you apparently so that throughout your mistakes and problems of life, the grace is always enveloping you, holding you up, forgiving you, giving you the restoration.
Yeah, I like that image. Grace is kind of holding you up, because we would just live in a bathtub if it was the other way around. Like, oh, I just need to be baptized, or I need to have my feet washed every time I make a mistake. That does not line up with the Reformed belief.
I think making a mistake and being led to your death are not quite on the same scale.
Maybe.
What? Say that again?
I don't believe that making mistakes and being led to your death are on the same scale. But I'm going to admit that, like everyone else, this is from my own experiences and my own thoughts that I get stuck on some of this. So,
yeah, it's really difficult to think about Jesus caring for Judas in his final moments. But also, it's kind of like, well, what if I'm like Judas? Like, Jesus still is going to wash my feet, still going to feed me and offer me grace. There's something very compelling about that. I'm not saying that's easy.
I guess the point for me is when he does it.
But Jesus, and perhaps when he does it, is because Jesus knows kind of the sequence of events and may comprehend the fact that he may never see Judas again. And so he can't, after the fact, after the betrayal, go back and forgive Judas. So he's got to do it now. Maybe.
Yeah. So, what is the disciples' role once they have been washed, once their feet have been washed? This is in verses 13 and 14.
Why it says it so simply, I did it to you, you do it.
Yes. So, what does that mean for us? Do we need to go and just wash people's feet? So a couple of questions for reflection. What do you think would be a modern day foot washing that most wouldn't be willing to do for another person? Something that most people probably wouldn't be willing to do for another person. As I was writing the children's devotion for this week, I wrote in the scripture reflection, it's like if your teacher came over to your house and washed your toilets and scrubbed your toilets. It's something you probably wouldn't expect, and it would probably be kind of awkward, but you'd be very like it's a very humbling thing for that teacher to do. But maybe for us, what are other things that, because we get this kind of invitation to do what Jesus has done, and we're blessed if we do them. So then what would some of those modern day foot washings?
If you don't mind, I'm going to use an example from a novel I'm reading.
Yeah.
Horseback Librarians, Kentucky, 1939, in a small mining town with lots of poor people in the hills and mountains. They went to this house, and the man, this horseback librarian woman, rode to this man's house, and he shot a hole through her hat. And the next time she came to the house, he had his gun up, but he didn't shoot it. And the next time they talk about it, he has his arms relaxed at his side, but his voice is still rough. And the next time they come to visit, the 11-year-old daughter is asking, who didn't hardly know how to read, from the books they've been giving him each time they shoot through the hat and all this stuff. The 11-year-old girl asked to read Black Beauty.
I'm sorry, the siren just went.
His 11-year-old daughter, his wife is dying, he's raising the two little girls, and the little girl asks if the horseback librarian can bring her Black Beauty.
Oh.
Look at that grace, going that the librarians on horseback persisted with this man, shot through the hat, being yelled at, and at the end, the younger of the two daughters gave the horseback librarian a big hug and said, "I can't wait till you get here next week." And the father admitted, sadly, that he was sorry and that he was adjusting to taking care of his children and worried about taking care of them.
Yeah, it's a lot of grace.
There were two horseback riders in that story, but they worshiped. How do you shut it off?
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any other examples of what you would consider like modern day-ish foot washing?
I'm stuck on the part that you wouldn't be willing to do. A thing I could see that is sort of maybe yes, maybe no, would be donating an organ.
Donating an organ.
To
Absolutely.
someone who's dying. You're a match. Family member. I think that's a foot washing kind of action. I haven't been asked to do that, so I don't know if other people would be willing or not willing to do it. But I think it would certainly be a question to struggle with.
Or you've had a flood in your basement and someone comes over unasked and helps you get all the soggy things out of your basement.
Yeah.
Clean up.
Yeah, especially like natural disasters, some of that repair and restoration. Bill, were you going to say something?
I'm sort of stuck on something.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at the foot washing as something, so I was about to say pedestrian, I don't mean that as a pun. But he's saying to Peter, if you don't let me cleanse you, if you don't let me save you, if you don't let me cleanse you of your sins, you have no part in it.
Yeah.
So then he accepts it, and then he says, okay, now you go on and do that to others. Go on and forgive others, love others, serve others. Feed them, clothe them, house them. And I think, I don't know, that's just the way I'm seeing it.
Yeah.
I'm doing this for you, I'm serving you, now you go on and serve others.
Yeah. So, Bill, you kind of just like took my sermon. So, unconditional election in a way, is saying, we don't choose Jesus, Jesus chooses us. Unconditional, like, we are chosen people, no matter what.
And he shows us the way.
Yeah, and we can be resistant to that. We can definitely be resistant to that grace. Judas, Peter. And how do we accept that? How to receive that grace? That's a good question. Yeah. And how do we live that out too? Once it's been accepted, how does someone live out that grace? By going out, serving others, humbling ourselves. Yeah.
I don't think he's saying that at all. I think I'm in the wrong denomination. I don't think I belong with the tulip friend. I think he is saying, you are going to let me do this, or you're not going to receive my grace. It was like what we talked about last week. I mean, if I know Jesus is going to do this come hell or high water, it makes no difference whether I say yes or no. He's already determined that I'm saved and I'm going to get his grace. And works has nothing to do with it. And that's where I get hung up on a lot of this stuff, because personally, I believe works does have something to do with it.
Works definitely are a part of it, but it's not the whole picture. And tulip, I would say the bedrock of tulip is grace.
There's no G in tulip.
The bedrock of tulip is grace. Just so total depravity. We need Jesus. We need grace. Unconditional election. God choosing.
What does that mean?
Unconditional election?
Yeah.
God choosing us. God chooses us. And really, it kind of like, so when people say, when did you come to know Jesus? I kind of want to say, well, actually, Jesus chose me before the beginning of time. Because really, it was about God choosing us and not us choosing God. That's what unconditional election.
And God would have chosen us whether to send Jesus or not.
And I think, but looking at this also, it's difficult because there are people we don't like. There are people we don't like, and we don't want God to have chosen them. We wish that, Jesus didn't wash Judas's feet. We wish that Jesus didn't, care about Peter. There are people that in our lives, it's hard because Scripture and big ideas like this, it's hard because we take them very personally. We put them into our context. And so what's difficult about it is yes, it's great when I'm chosen, but I want to choose who else is chosen.
But why I don't think he should have washed Judas's feet is because of Judas's work. The work of betraying him. That's a verb. That's an action. So if work doesn't count because you've got grace, then why bother?
Our works are a response. Not we don't work to be saved. We work because we've been saved. That's how I've always looked at it.
Yes.
God has given me grace, and because I've been given that grace, I want to do something in a thankful response to that.
And that is what the Reformed belief would be, is that, yes, Bill.
Good works are an expression of having received grace.
But you're going to get that grace whether you do good works or not.
Correct.
I agree, but because I've been given that grace, I want to do something. I'm thankful for that, and I want to do something to show my thankfulness.
This is sort of like the debate which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
No,
No.
it's not.
Grace comes
Grace
first.
first, and because you got your grace, it changes your whole attitude. I am totally transformed in how I think and how I look at people and things.
But even if you don't accept that grace,
You can't, you have,
no,
you can't.
you've got it. Whether you, if you believe that, then God gives you grace no matter what you do. And it may transform you and how you respond to grace. It may transform Rick, the way he responds to it. It may have no effect on me. Yeah, so that's a nice bonus that I get of being a human being, and I can go on, and I can be nasty to people, and I can steal things, etc.
And I don't think you'd accept the grace.
Pardon?
I don't think you have accepted grace then.
It's not a matter of accepting, it's given. I don't have to accept it.
If I give you a Christmas present, you have the choice of accepting it from me or not accepting it from me.
That's true. It doesn't mean you didn't give
But
me
the gift is
present.
always
The gift
there.
is always there.
It's available for everybody, it's up to you to accept it, whatever it is.
Yeah. And so it's hard, once again, it's hard because there are people in our lives that betray us, that deny us, that hurt us. We don't want them to be extended grace. We don't want them to be chosen,
But it's not our choice.
but it's not our choice.
So I can dislike a lot of people. I can think bad things about a lot of people. And that's between me and you as a person. It has nothing to do with God. God's going to accept both of us.
Well, I think that God would accept you, but really, would you accept the grace that God has given you, and would you accept the actions? Would you accept the responsibility of your actions? That's what I would wonder about. But
This is a forever discussion.
so we are going to, yes, we are going to wrap up. And the final question for reflection that I'll leave you with is, when in your life has it been difficult to see others be chosen or forgiven when you don't think they deserve it? What can we learn from Jesus' example in this? And you're right, Chris, this is a forever conversation. This is something we've been talking about since the beginning of the Reformation. And some might even say since the beginning of time. But I will try to tackle it this week. See what happens. So I'm going to stop the recording now.